Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome so much. Thank you for joining us for Facing Civil Rights Threats Together. And in truth, since we are facing these issues together, we want to invite you to scan this code over here where you can participate in a small poll we're doing on civil rights issues. And for anybody who's not comfortable doing the poll at the end, I'm going to invite you to share what your concerns are, because we've got leading folks from the major civil rights organizations up here together, and part of why we're here is to learn from you what you're concerned about. With that said, I'm Kalpana Pedibotla, and I'm the Executive Director of the South Asian American Justice Collaborative, or SAJCO. And we're a new national organization whose mission is to fight for the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the U.S. And we aspire to do that through community engagement, like we are doing today, direct legal services, and impact litigation. Because we are so new, we're just 1 year old, I feel especially humbled to share the stage with the folks up here. Their organizations have been leading this fight for decades for South Asian communities, along with other Asian American communities. And I'm so grateful that you all accepted my invitation to come down here and for travel for great distances from the Midwest and New York. And so thank you. Before we launch into this discussion, I'd like to invite each of my panelists to provide a brief introduction, sharing their name and organization and their role, because we've got a lot that we want to unpack today. So I wish we could do justice to their esteemed careers, but hopefully you'll all look them up because they're absolutely wonderful. Starting with you, Isa. Thank you.
Hi, all. Oh, wow, what a lovely mic. Hi, everyone. My name is Isa. My pronouns are she and they, and truthfully, when Kalpana called me to be on this panel, I was racing around another airport and in the middle of some rapid response with dear friends who are here, actually from Asian Refugees United, and got to hug many of them in person for the first time today. There's nothing quite like being in deep, rapid response against some of these systemic threats that you all are taking the poll over. To get to know someone so intimately, whether it's over the phone or on a Zoom screen, and then to actually reach out and touch them, it's really something. A little bit about myself and my work. I am an attorney with the Asian Law Caucus, or ALC. You all might be familiar with ALC. We were the first Asian-led civil rights organization established about half a decade ago. We're primarily based in San Francisco, but myself, I am from Michigan, proud daughter of Detroit, have practiced law there, and currently operate a network called the Asian American Leaders Table. I'm really struck at the Slido poll because it seems like hate rhetoric and violence and immigration enforcement are sort of neck and neck here, in terms of priorities for our communities. And the Asian American Leaders Table actually was formed around those two issues. So this is a national network of 70 groups, including many of the groups here, actually the groups here with us on the panel as well. And we first came together in March of 2020, shortly before the Atlanta spa shootings, and also around, at the time, the first Muslim ban. And in those days, so many of our communities were just wrapping our heads around those issues. And there were these challenges around racial wedging. So many of us are often pitted against each other in situations of scarcity. So the table was formed. Fast forward, here we are having many of the same conversations, but fortunately with a lot of new partnerships and a lot more commitment to solidarity. I'll say more, but I know we have a whole rich discussion to get through, and I'll pass it to Niji.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having us, and thanks for joining this panel. I'm Niji Jain. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the legal director at the Asian American Legal Defense and Education Fund. So another national organization that is working to protect and advance the civil rights of the broader Asian American communities. We were founded in 1974, so just hit the 50-year mark last year, and are based in New York, but do work. We have cases and other projects in about, I think, 23 or so states, so have a decently broad reach. Our work is pretty varied. We do work in a lot of the spaces that are represented in the poll. We have an immigrants' rights program, an anti-Asian violence program. We do voting rights work. We have an education equity project, as well as an economic justice for low-wage workers program, and an anti-displacement program trying to do housing and environmental justice work. And I think one of the through lines for us, and one of our most important focuses, is thinking about who within the Asian American community or communities is most vulnerable and most marginalized, and then trying to center our work around those communities. And so often what that looks like is that we are working with folks who are low income, or folks who have a vulnerable immigration status, or people who are limited English proficient. And so, in New York City, where a lot of folks come to the United States, and that's the first place that they go. And they're in deeply immigrant neighborhoods where they don't have access to a lot of the services and rights and privileges that a lot of Americans expect and believe that they are going to have. A lot of our work is trying to build up those communities to make sure that they're educated on their rights, that they have meaningful access to those rights, and can build their power, so that they can then advocate for their own communities. And so we're thinking about how to provide legal support through all the different tools in a lawyer's toolkit. And I think, I'll just say one more thing, which is that I grew up in Atlanta, in the South in the 80s and 90s, and it was a really different conversation back then, being a South Asian person. I don't think, if we had done this panel in the early 90s in Atlanta, I don't know that there would have been this many people showing up to have that conversation. And so I really, really appreciate you all being here and wanting to learn and share what you have been seeing, and for us to brainstorm together on how we can meet this moment. So thanks for being here.
Good morning, everyone. My name's Sim Singh Atariwala, pronouns he, him. I'm the director of the Anti-Hate Program at Advancing Justice AJC. And as you can tell by that name, my work focuses on combating hate, defending civil rights, and advancing policies that protect marginalized communities, similar to what many of these other national organizations here have convened to talk about. Advancing Justice AJC has several program areas that focus at the national level of advocacy, including democratic programs that address voting rights, the census, as well as immigration, anti-Asian hate, profiling, as well as education equity and technology portfolios. And we also have a community partners network that exists in 38 states with over 300 state and local organizations. And we have affiliates in Atlanta, Chicago, and California. But I think the through line between all of our organizations here is that we do impact litigation. And Advancing Justice AJC has filed lawsuits challenging the Trump administration in its attacks on birthright citizenships, attacks on diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility initiatives, actions to freeze or terminate grants on immigration or citizenship legal services, and efforts to implement additional proof of citizenship requirements when it comes to voter registration. And there's also the termination of grants that address hate crimes. But we can get into all of that in today's conversation, so I'll pass it back over to Kalpana.
Thank you so much. In 2025, as our panelists just described, we're finding ourselves in a moment where civil rights protections are being rolled back. And while all in the context of when our country is grappling with a fight over American identity and who gets to define that identity and who's recognized as a part of this nation's fabric and whose stories are excluded. I so appreciated the framing in that plenary where the moderator reminded everybody that we've been here for 150 years. In truth, there's actually evidence we've been here going all the way back to the founding, where unfortunately folks were trafficked, enslaved, and brought in from the Caribbean at the founding of our country. So we're part of this nation's fabric. Yet, we're in this period where we're seeing new forms of intimidation, tactics against our communities that is trying to silence our voices. And I'm going to start there, friends, with that question. What I guess is, how are your organizations responding, especially where we've seen the Supreme Court just greenlight racial profiling in Los Angeles, ICE raids, and you and I have been talking about the masked agents who refuse to identify themselves, therefore opening the door for people to commit hate crimes against our communities. And so I'd love to start with Sim, since you're right to my right. How is your organization responding, and what do you need, to the extent there may be legislative aides and other policymakers in the room, what do you need from our policymakers?
Thank you for that question. The Asian American community has been at the forefront of affirming birthright citizenship ever since the landmark case of U.S. versus Wong Kim Ark. And in that case, the United States sought to deny citizenship of children of Chinese immigrants, and that was struck down by the Supreme Court in 1898. Looking at today, Kalpana foreshadowed this, but immigrant communities are facing intensified enforcement and racial profiling, which has been bolstered by the Supreme Court rulings. And like you correctly pointed out, the Supreme Court's majority of justices signal that race can be used to justify immigration enforcement. Contrast that actually to the Supreme Court's majority years ago in Students for Fair Admissions versus Harvard, striking down race-conscious admissions, arguing that any race-based policy must serve a compelling government interest and be narrowly tailored to achieve that interest. And that kind of reveals a double standard that is really troubling. Race can't be used to expand opportunity for our communities, but it can be used to justify surveillance and exclusion. It's a stark reminder that the legal system is being weaponized to dismantle equity while legitimizing discrimination. And Justice Sotomayor's dissent is relevant because she thinks that this would create a second-class citizenship status of people who may be subject to harassment. In my view, that's a concerning pathway to require people in our country to fit stereotype depictions of what it means to be an American in order to move freely about in our country. And the administration has used military posts as detention centers, echoing Japanese incarceration from World War II. And ICE raids like the one in Hyundai in Georgia involve the masked agents. And that does expose vulnerabilities for impersonation and abuse. Similarly, we've seen a number of individuals arrested for impersonating ICE and immigration enforcement officials. We need policymakers to critically review these cases and assess whether these bad actors are selecting communities through a targeted means to inflict terror into our communities. Arguably, these types of crimes should be met with hate crime charges. These policy frameworks also permit states and localities to enact additional measures to ensure that there's greater distinctions between what the federal government is doing when it comes to enforcement practices and how the state and local level differs here. And that can also create an official record documenting the links between racist ideology and current immigration enforcement policies. And it is one mechanism where we can have increased accountability. But I also want to remind everyone here that citizenship has been conditional and still is. Almost 100 years ago, the Bhagat Singh Thind case is a powerful reminder that citizenship in America has never been fixed in a neutral concept. Thind was a Sikh American World War I veteran who was denied citizenship not because of law, but because of racial perception. And the Supreme Court ruled that white meant that the average American, it meant what the average American thought it meant, not what science or legal precedent said. And the ruling there ended up with denaturalizing a number of South Asians as a result. And we're seeing continued denaturalization efforts. Today we're seeing new efforts to strip birthright citizenship, including executive orders and political rhetoric. And these proposals echo the same logic as the Thind case, that citizenship should be conditional based on race, origin, or perceived loyalty, not constitutional guarantees. And that fluidity of citizenship, who gets to keep it, who's deserving, who's excluded, has always been a reflection of power, not principle. And that's something I want to make sure that we all keep in mind. But what we're doing at Advancing Justice AJC is we continue to file legal challenges in an attempt of the administration to eliminate birthright citizenship, filing amicus as well with Asian Law Caucus on behalf of more than 60 Asian American organizations. And last week, we obtained a temporary restraining order to halt the deportation of vulnerable, unaccompanied immigrant children as young as 10 years old in the dark of night on a holiday weekend without due process. There's a lot of advocacy that we can continue to do, but I want to reserve some time for my other co-panelists.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive answer. Niji, before I turn it over to you, I just want to ask by a show of hands, Sim said something really important. Citizenship has always been conditional in the United States. Who in this room is aware of how that is taking place right now, where people can be denaturalized or may not receive citizenship because they do not receive they do not meet the good moral character requirements of the community that they reside in? Have you all heard about these orders? All right, I see a lot of nodding. Thank you so much. Pass it down to Niji to carry on the conversation.
Yeah, so obviously the environment of fear around immigration enforcement and ICE raids has created a lot of chaos and anguish in our communities. And one of the things that we have been seeing on the ground is the ripple effects that that the environment has, right? It's not just about the folks who are actually getting denied their visas, or who are, international students who are being asked to leave, or folks who are getting pressured to self-deport. It's also their families, their neighbors, their communities who are too afraid to go to work, or who are not, kids who are afraid to go to school because they're worried that when they come home, their mom and dad aren't going to be there, right? It's all of the things that happen to the broader diaspora and the broader network of folks who are part of those families and those systems. And all of that together is deep collective harm, and it creates trauma that can take generations to overcome. And what it means is that we are constantly being made to question, are we American? Are we American enough? And that's something that, again, thinking about like when I grew up in the United States a few decades ago, I always had that question, like, am I Indian? Am I Indian enough? Am I American? Am I American enough? But those were questions that I, at least at that time, was thinking about as, kind of in a social sense. I didn't feel quite as viscerally that it was the government telling me that I wasn't enough to belong here. And I think that over time, over decades, that I was very, very lucky and very privileged to not have to think about that as an Indian American person, with the specific sort of situation and circumstances that I had. But I know that there were a lot of other folks who were having those conversations in their families, and whose communities were being pushed to the margins and are still being pushed to the margins, because that has been going on from our country's founding. And what we're seeing today is that all of a sudden it is coming for everyone. And I think, in some sense, it's really important that all of that is being made plain, because it's always been there. It's always been lurking. And I think some communities have had enough either protection or privilege or access to be able to avoid it for some amount of time. But the reality is that folks who don't want us to be here, we're always going to find a way to make that clear. And so now we're at the point where everyone, right, people are being really open and vocal about who belongs and who doesn't. And I think that, scary though that is, it really gives us an opportunity to show the type of solidarity and allyship that we should, that we ideally should have been, and I think have been, partnering all along with other vulnerable communities. So all the other communities of color, whether whether it's folks that we know or who are in our neighborhoods or who we can't really relate to, but with whom we feel some deep sense of solidarity, because we know that we're all in it together, and that if they come for one, then they come for all. And I think, I say all of that because part of what we at ALDEF have been doing and continue to do is really think about the ways that we can connect the dots of history. And so, like Sim was saying, there was a time when Chinese folks weren't allowed to become U.S. citizens because of the Chinese Exclusion Act. That then expanded to all Asian Americans, and then there was the denaturalization and the citizenship stripping of Indian Americans, and then that was, right, Sim said that was in World War I. Fast forward to World War II, and Japanese Americans were told that they're not American. And then you fast forward to 9/11, and South Asian and Muslim folks were told you were not American. And so that cycle goes on and on and on. But the important thing is, how are we showing solidarity with one another? And one of the other things that we at ALDEF think a lot about is, how can we help tell those stories and connect those dots of history? One of the important things that we need in order to be able to do that is access to quality legal representation and also access to data, because we can't know what's happening if people aren't, if we don't have the numbers, the stories, the statistics. And one of the things that we have seen is, at the same time that the government is trying to block pathways for people to be here, and block pathways for people to vote, and block pathways for people to have access to education, they're also blocking the ability for us to collect information so that we can have the numbers to advocate and to tell those stories. And so all of those things go together. And so it can feel like, oh, data, like that's the least of our concerns. But it's all part and parcel of a broader plan to take away the tools that we have to advocate for ourselves. And so just to bring it back, Kalpana, to the question you asked at the beginning around what do we need from policymakers, is that we need folks to stand up for some of that infrastructure that has existed, whether that's funding for legal services or requirements for transparency, so that we can know what's happening and so that we can organize to push back against it.
Hi, y'all. I'm an attorney, but I'll answer this like an organizer. And if folks are sitting here and just feeling the weight of this, the heaviness of not just the intersectionality of the challenges, but the barriers that are essentially having us work even harder to do some of this work because we're a little bit more burned out. We might have fewer staff members, fewer funding, et cetera. The hope of this moment is, as Niji said, we've been in this fight before. I was lucky enough to spend some time as a very young person on the carpet of the home of Grace Lee Boggs, one of the wonderful humanists of our time, an incredible racial justice leader out of Detroit. And Grace would say, the most radical thing I could do is stay. And think about that, right? That's really the basis of so much of our sanctuary work, that in the 70s and 80s, when Central American loved ones were getting snatched, it was faith leaders who often were working in quite conservative communities who said, we're not going to take that. Yes, today we do have the proliferation of things like 287G agreements, which are kind of encouraging law enforcement to go the other way, right? We're seeing almost the other side organize in a way that is quite alarming, whether you're out the door here looking at the National Guard on our sidewalks, or in many of our rapid response situations, when we get a call, a loved one might say, hey, someone knocked on my door, they didn't identify themselves, they didn't have a warrant, I don't know who they were, but my loved one is gone. So what do we do in that moment? And then to offer a complement to that, to what Grace Lee said, which is, the most radical thing I could do is stay. I think about the parallel, but also the contrast of something like the Underground Railroad, where some of us, maybe our calling is not to fight for the stay, but to help our loved ones, help our communities get to that other side, whatever that other side looks like. And I say that too because we're at this really unprecedented time where folks are, for example, considering things like self-deportation. As a baby attorney during Trump 1.0, this was somewhat unheard of, right? Like what? But so many of us are wrapped in these situations where loved ones are being shackled at multiple points of their bodies. They're being put on a 60-plus hour flight. And to the point of my co-panelists about solidarity, we need to have solidarity to survive because we're literally all being put on the same plane. So last week, for example, there was a very large flight of over 200 folks shuttled quickly through the country, put into a staging area. In some cases, it's Alexandria, Louisiana, also known as the human FedEx destination. They were put on a large military flight, went to Romania, Nepal, Qatar, then went to a number of Southeast Asian countries, so Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. And just uplifting that because it is the same tools of oppression, but for different communities. Something that I get a lot when I do Know Your Rights trainings is inevitably, whether it's my community, which is the Filipino community, the Hmong community, the Bhutanese community, there is inevitably a point where someone says, I wish I found you all sooner. There's a loved one in my family with a really old criminal record. We thought they wouldn't come for us. We didn't want to ask for help. We had a lot of shame. And so if there's a silver lining in this moment and something that our lawmakers can be really helpful with, there is an awakening that's happening across our communities. And can our lawmakers get on board? Another thing I want to touch on briefly, there's a myth that Project 2025 was the only blueprint in existence that, we got out organized. And perhaps that's true on some level, but there is something like the New Way Forward Act, for example. So if folks aren't familiar with this act, it is an act that was introduced by Congressman Greg Caesar and others in 2023, and it actually does a lot of we really need in this moment. So one example is it calls for the end of mandatory detention. When ICE comes for our loved ones, they are not put in procedures that often come in state criminal court, for example. So process, due process, fair administration of policy, all those things look a little bit differently with our immigration system. In many ways, the immigration judge is judge and jury, so this act attempted to add some balance to that. It also tried to restore judicial discretion. So right now, a lot of our loved ones are being targeted by ICE because there are categories that lead to often targeting, detention, and sometimes lifetime bans from reentering the country. This process would add a little bit more humanity so that folks' individual cases could be assessed. Another part of this act is also prohibiting state and local law enforcement cooperation, right? We're seeing this even in, sort of bastions of progressive action, that there is more law enforcement cooperation than ever. And also, in parallel to the New Way Forward Act, a number of our Southeast Asian partners are actually here in DC over the next couple of days, and they're trying to similarly challenge deportations to countries like Laos, where there is actually no repatriation agreement between the United States and Laos. So Sim mentioned earlier this challenge we're seeing now increasingly of third country removals. So loved ones who are being taken, swept away to Ghana, to Eswatini, places where they have no connection at all. Again, prior to this administration, this was not happening en masse. And for my beloved colleagues at ARU, Asian Refugees United, who are here in the center of the room, please see them for the closing. They actually are standing in the breach of some of these newer deportations too. So ARU right now is leading rapid response to the removals to Bhutan, where folks are essentially expelled within 24 hours from the border. This is something that the US has full knowledge of, and it's not just a single expulsion through deportation from the United States, but because Bhutanese officials are essentially saying you cannot stay here, folks are then forced to literally wander across India, across Nepal for sometimes hundreds of miles. Sometimes they're placed on taxis covertly. And in one case, an Ohio loved one actually passed away due to a lot of the tumult of this. So again, these things are not supposed to be happening, but we're also in a moment where Uplifting ARU, this is a youth organization who prior to this time was doing things like youth soccer and the arts, and they're still doing those things and doing those things well. They're just also now operating on a continuum of immigrant rights, helping loved ones do things like records requests, because this is often such a barrier to fighting your removal case. So I think I'll end there.
Thanks so much, Isa. Thanks so much for that and for uplifting our friends at ARU. I'm going to just change paces here and just we're going to end our conversation around 2:30 just to checkpoint us. So shifting from these policy changes, enforcement actions, I want to get to the dialogue that's happening within our own communities. And I sense you all are hungry for that because I see nodding heads, and people are probably up on WhatsApp chat conversations. And some of the things that I struck me. This most radical thing I can do is stay. And Niji's comments about the ripple effects. So one of the ripple effects, and this is on all the WhatsApp, is if I travel and I'm a U.S. citizen, do I need to carry my passport to go from California to Arizona, from Texas to DC? That question is coming. And so I have a few questions I want to pack in here. The most radical thing I can do is stay. What does resistance look like for us right now? What should we be Should we be carrying our U.S. passports, or should we be refusing to carry our U.S. passports? Is this our lunch counter moment? What decisions we should be making, right? So I just want to throw some ideas out there. But let's start with, how do we challenge the internalized myths within South Asian communities and build solidarity across racial lines? And I'd love it if you can also bring into this conversation some of the things I was just talking about.
So the model minority myth, certainly something that we need to confront, as well as the good-bad immigrant dichotomy that we see playing out, which is weaponized to divide our community specifically. And it suggests that the model minority myth suggests that some in our community have made it, while ignoring those who have not, and it masks systemic inequities within our communities. And it's just simply not true that all Asian Americans are well educated or affluent. But we got to name the internalized racism and class divisions that make some communities susceptible to those kinds of narratives. I think the theme here as well is the solidarity element here that requires us to continue to confront these myths. And that's something that we need to recognize, that sometimes these contradictions within our community is an assimilation pressure, and sometimes it's survival strategies for our communities. But I think right now we are all thinking about the ways in which that is no longer serving us. And I want to come back to the Students for Fair Admissions case. And the model minority myth there was weaponized to divide our community, to suggest that we were somehow going to benefit from dismantling race-conscious admissions in higher education. But right now what we're seeing is a shifting narrative. Now that the Asian American community has been used for that, conservatives are no longer embracing the very minorities they considered good. And that narrative has shifted now to punishment for us. And so the good versus bad immigrant framework is collapsing for these communities. And if a non-white demographic becomes too successful, they are no longer favored. They become threats to the dominant community right now. And so extremist groups are already calling for violence against Indian Americans after the August 12th Florida crash involving an Indian truck driver. South Asians in the Republican Party, like Vivek Ramaswamy, face white supremacist rallies and death threats from within their own ranks. White House AI advisor Srinam Krishnan faced racist abuse after his appointment. And AJC's analysis of the recent FBI hate crime statistics data for 2024 shows that anti-Asian hate crimes remain nearly 3 times higher than pre-pandemic levels. Anti-Asian hate has not gone away. The data still continues to reflect that. And to Niji's point, we must continue to make sure that the data reporting aspect is there, because otherwise it becomes invisible. Policymakers will think that the problem has been solved, mission accomplished, and that is not the case, and we all know that here sitting in this room. And I'll also point out to the Asian American Foundation's survey, where they said that 40% of Americans believe that Asian Americans are more loyal to their countries of origin, and 1 in 4 view Chinese Americans as a threat to U.S. society. That's some shocking figures and statistics. And despite our high educational attainment in some communities and earnings, South Asians are being demonized now as job stealers in the H-1B debates. We're viewed as national security threats. And per Stop API Hate's recent reporting, over 44,000 anti-South Asian slurs were documented in extremist online spaces between May and June of this year. We continue to see these spikes whenever the H-1B debates come into the political rhetoric. So what I want to, the point is that I'm making here is that these myths continue to obscure inequities and make our communities susceptible to xenophobic appeals. So we need to rely on pre-bunking strategies, inoculate our communities against this type of misinformation, and understand and teach them about how our minority communities are being exploited. We need to continue doing more cross-racial organizing and reject the exceptionalism, because our liberation is bound up with other communities. We also need to invest in community resilience and mutual aid programs. These are going to be imperative because we're not going to see our communities continue to put faith and trust in government systems to report hate crimes, to report rapes, to report their census affiliations. There are going to be trickle effects here that are going to be monumental and pose a real risk to our communities' political and civic engagement moving forward.
Yeah, I think I really echo all of what you all are saying, and I think, one of the things that that people that I have heard folks talking about a lot is, of course it's really bad what ICE is doing, but people should come here the right way, right? How many of you have heard that? Have heard somebody say that, right? And so it really begs this question of, like, how much do we understand the history and the forces, sociopolitically and everything else that lead to situations where people have different pathways to come to the United States. I think it's really easy to be in a little bit of a bubble and think, okay, well, everyone I know came here the right way, so why can't those other folks do it too? But just to give a little bit of the counterfactual, in New York City, the number one group with pending asylum claims, so folks who are seeking asylum in order to be able to stay here, is Chinese Americans at 80,000. That's how many Chinese Americans are waiting to have an asylum case adjudicated. Number two is Indian Americans at 8,000. Those are, and then obviously there's a huge cliff between those two numbers, and then there's another huge cliff right before you even get to the third group. And so what we know is that these groups, right, Indian Americans, Chinese Americans, who people have this idea they are the model minorities. And in fact, what we're seeing is the numbers tell us a different story. And that matters because when we think about something like ending birthright citizenship for the children of people who are undocumented, or or trying to enforce immigration laws against people with criminal convictions or what have you, I think there's this stereotype in our communities and maybe the conversations that are being had at the mandir and the gurdwara and the mosque that are saying, well, that's too bad, but, we're okay. But the reality is, it turns out that's not true. It's just that it's, to Aisa's point from earlier, there's a lot of shame, and so we're not talking about it. And that is, not only does that do disservice to the people in our own communities who are harmed, but it also prevents us from organizing and activating and then exercising our rights and our privileges because we're too uncomfortable to even have the conversation. And so I think, if we're talking about narrative change and the conversations that we can be having individually, personally, the conversation that you can have with the auntie or uncle in your life, it's dispelling some of these myths and saying, we all rise and fall together, and we have seen that time and time again. But look, I'm a civil rights lawyer, and I spend all day, every day, thinking about these issues. But then when I go home and talk to my aunties and uncles, I'm like, ooh, this is really uncomfortable. That's easier to just talk about the bao bhaji, right? I don't want to do that because it evokes all those things that make us feel small or divided. And there's a little bit of that courage that we all have, and this is the moment to have those conversations because it all starts in those small little spaces. And you have that conversation and you come with a few facts and stats and you get someone thinking, and you're not going to change their mind overnight, but they're going to think about it, and maybe they're going to, read an article in a different light, or maybe from a different publication, and you're planting a seed, and that matters. And that's something that each and every one of us can do, and it doesn't have to be the thing that you wait for the policymakers or, the South Asian person who got elected to Congress. They don't have to do that convincing. We can do that. And so, this is, and also it's like maybe you're talking to your little brother or your, whoever who hasn't even thought about these issues at all. And this is your chance to have them kind of move out of the bubble that they're in. Like, I bet every person here has, a cousin or a nephew or a whoever who works in tech, right? And they are like on a different planet. They have no idea what's going on. And those are the people who can make things move, right? They can put their money where their mouth is if they know the issues. And it's our responsibility to talk about those things.
Thanks so much, Niji. Just wanted to comment one thing about what you said, and that, with respect to asylum, as our borders are largely closed, and at the southern border primarily. Asylum goes back to the founding of the nation, but how many people think that asylum is an illegitimate way to enter the United States? And it's actually the foundational principle of the United States was asylum. So I would, when you're having those policy conversations, just insert a little bit of that into there. You can even literally quote the founders of this nation that it was intended that the United States would be for people who are facing persecution, religious persecution, to come to the United States. All right, Isa, we'll get you in here, and then we're going to turn the mic over to this audience. So
yeah, you heard it here first, y'all. So call your mom, call your no, but I did think about my mom because every time I see her, she inevitably has a tech hiccup. And so sometimes she'll give me her iPad. And I've noticed over the last year and a half, the ads, whatever algorithm is targeting her, it is getting more and more conservative and often is filled with misinfo and disinfo. And so just praise to the folks in the room. I know there's Step API Hate is here. There are many of us working in that really critical in-language misinfo and disinfo sector. As Niji said, every moment is an opportunity to jump in. For myself, with the Filipino community, much of our colonization process began with the United States promising us, hey, if you keep your head down, if you adapt to these certain cultural norms, it's all good. So we actually have a Filipino value called hiya, and it literally translates to shame. So it's like we were given this code book that, as Sim mentioned, it's failing us. ALDEF and ALC, we both do poll monitoring during the election, and something that came up on the East Coast was both in Pennsylvania and New York, there were papers targeting Chinese elders, and it was a split paper, so one side had Kamala Harris, the other side had Donald Trump, and we shared it with our team, and the translation was basically, hey, if you vote for Trump, you'll get $1 billion. You will find security forever. If you vote for Kamala, there will be hellfire. Maybe there were some pragmatic things in there, but it was pretty extreme. And on one level, you think, oh, that's kind of cartoonish. Who would buy that? But so many of these decisions are born of waves and waves of intentional funding that is being directed at our communities. And so by the time someone gets someone with a message saying Kamala Harris, a black woman, is bringing hellfire, they might actually be poised to believe it. Kenneth, who's an old colleague at an organization called Chinese for Affirmative Action, often brings up the phrase Black Lives Matter as translated into Chinese. And depending on the translation, it can actually mean Black lives are expensive, depending on the translation, right? So thinking about how even phrasing that's meant to build solidarity and awareness can be co-opted and used against us, we have to be not just really vigilant, but we have to talk to each other. And one final thing I'll say, Know Your Rights trainings are an amazing narrative change opportunity because you are sitting down with an auntie and uncle who might not have any idea, of the intricacies of the criminal justice system, but really breaking it down, avoiding the jargon, and just speaking plainly with what is happening. Why are we seeing folks disappeared from this country based on 30-year-old charges they picked up as a teenager and based on a plea deal that they couldn't read or understand? Just laying this bare, as my panelists have said, can be better than some of the very high up academic narrative change agents that sometimes can be actually kind of polarizing and can bring a lot of distance.
Thank you very much, Isa. Those are very practical ideas. We have 10 minutes before the next session, so this one started 10 minutes late. We're going to turn over the mic for you all. So up here you see that looks like most people here in this room are most concerned with the hate rhetoric and violence followed by immigration enforcement. Adi, you want to grab that mic? I'm going to invite. I know there's no people aren't shy in this room, so I'm going to ask you, what's one civil rights issue that you think is under discussed in our communities, which could even be the ones that we have up on the screen? So.
I got it. Okay, hi, I'm Chitra Kumar. I work for the Union of Concerned Scientists, which is a national science advocacy organization, and many of our community members were told they needed to study science and go into this field, and now I work on climate justice issues. So I have a question that is related to that. To answer your point, is this issue of climate justice and immigration is so important right now. One of the issues I'm finding just today, I learned I'm going on a field trip in the Chicago area about a clean energy facility, and I'm being asked, or anyone who is going to go on this field trip who is is a green card holder needs to be reported 2 weeks in advance to get cleared to be on that trip, which includes an energy company that I'm not going to name today, although if you want to hear about it later, I'd love to tell you more about it. And I asked the question, I was like, wait a second, I'm a naturalized citizen. How are you going to know the difference between me and someone who is not reported? And do I need to bring my passport? Because I didn't get an answer to that exactly from any of you about whether that was act of resistance for me to bring it or not bring it. And I'm working on these issues, and I'm mad about this now. And I would like to understand how we do some basic work on clean energy, which of course is under attack too. And all science is under attack. Anything that requires knowledge and facts is under attack. And I take that very personally because I think, in the big plenary, they were talking about we should live into the fact that we're Indian Americans and we're overrepresented in medicine. I wonder whether that's actually a reason they're undermining all of science and funding for medicine right now. So I'm putting that out there as a question and also a comment here, and I'd love to collaborate with anyone who would like to afterwards. Thank you.
Thank you so much for sharing that perspective. Before we go to a few other folks, does anybody want to give a stab at the should she carry her passport question?
Yeah, we should totally talk after. This is a question that comes up a lot in Know Your Rights trainings, and because we're seeing attacks on both naturalized citizens, folks who are trying to enter into the naturalization process, typically there can be best practices around carrying a copy of your naturalization documents. It is very state by state as well, and the challenge is For example, in Ohio, we had a situation where a community member walked into a DMV just to get a real ID, and his naturalization documents, his original documents, were confiscated for 5 months. So that is a encouragement to not bring an original when you don't have to. But it's very case by case. And I wonder if my fellow panelists have other things to add.
So I'm going to just actually go to another question, if that's okay with you. And also, if y'all are willing to stay a few minutes afterwards, maybe people can come up. Gentleman right there.
Hi, my name is Parag Mehta. I worked at the White House Initiative on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders 25 years ago, and I remember the founders of all three of your organizations coming together right after 9/11, like within days, to create solidarity across the community for what we knew was about to happen, the hate crimes and the profiling. I appreciate, Niji, you talking about this moment of courage, calling us to courage. And Sim, I agree with you that we need to talk about collective liberation and how we're inextricably linked with other communities. But to me, if I answer your question, Kalpana, these issues are all important, but what's worrying me most right now is the attacks on our legal civil rights infrastructure. Because if we're going after law firms, we know that the 1960s civil rights movement was aided and abetted by legal aid societies and the fact that people were able to get representation in courts. So to me, the fact that academics, nonprofits, organizations like yours may be facing threats to their funding makes a big difference in terms of what we can talk about. And I applaud you three for talking about the hard things. And I follow all three of your organizations on social media. Beyond the topics we discussed today, all three of your organizations have been really vocal about a lot of social ills. But I'm worried that going forward, that's going to be less and less possible as we see the actions of government and other donors having a chilling effect on what civil rights advocates and lawyers can and will talk about.
Thank you so much for that, Parag. So resistance maybe looks like donating to these great organizations, right? Yeah. Thank you. Sajco.org. We have time left for, I think, one more question, and then I want to make sure you get a chance to speak with them and get to your next panel. There's somebody right here at the same table. It's a very active table here.
It's a great table over here.
Hi, my name is Khala Rafiq, and I am a community organizer at Humke Center. We organize Asian Americans, and I see some nodding here, so I think people already know us. So for everyone's surprise, I'm working for the immigration campaign these days, and I do business outreach. I literally go door to door and visit Asian American businesses. We have been hearing stories. I do Know Your Rights trainings also, both in person and online. There are many questions, and there are people who have been reporting that they are being visited by ICE, because my court geo is Loudoun County, Virginia, which is in the agreement of 287G, as you may know. So, and they are visited by ICE. They're ICE raids without any judicial warrant. So people do say, okay, what's the purpose of all this Know Your Rights? Because there's no due process. We don't have any right. I mean, I see a lot of frustration here. And of course, we are in collaboration with many other AAPI organizations. We all have power. How can we all work together to build this power, to put this collective, to put this theory of change into action? Because we all have power. So far, we have voting rights also. So how can we build upon this power, to make a change?
Great question. I just wanted to share, I think Know Your Rights is a form of resistance, right? We know that when Trump administration states that it will defund organizations that are doing Know Your Rights training. So Know Your Rights is a form of resistance. And I'm so proud that Asian Law Caucus and Sajco, we've been partnering on Know Your Rights programs, and we have a role play that's available for community organizers. Did anybody want to take a quick stab at answering that last question, though?
Yeah, I'd say I'm seeing the same too. And, there has to be a turning point. We're talking about the election like it's far away. It's going to be here tomorrow. And so all the great new threads that are being built from Rapid Response, from Know Your Rights trainings, these local relationships, how can we convert that into both, this broader political education and essentially turning up the vote? I'm also seeing, and then you might see the same, where so many of these trainings are also around family preparation. So having that tough conversation with auntie or uncle, you know, way before the ICE knock on the door, but in a position where they can maybe get to one of our organizations, do that records request, have that meeting with an attorney and contemplate their rights. In Michigan, where, you know, we tried to kidnap our governor. There are turning points I'm seeing, especially in counties that are red or red-blue with elected officials. And in the moment, folks who used to say a few months ago, I'm scared to speak up, I'm now seeing them take fiercer stands. We have some model legislation out that is both trying to curb some of the data sharing to ICE. So I'm gonna end on a hopeful note that it's worth it.
Thanks so much, Isa. Well, anyway, our time has already come to an end, and I feel like we could have gone a couple more hours. I want to thank our panelists and the depth and clarity that they've brought to this conversation, and for all of you for being here with us. So we've heard today that the rights that we once thought were secure are being tested again, and the response, though, cannot rest on a few shoulders. Right? It's going to take collective action. So my hope is that we're going to carry this conversation beyond this room, out into those chat and chai conversations with our friends and neighbors and aunties and uncles, though I am very much an auntie. And I appreciate all of you being here with us today. Thank you so much.